It's good to see you. Have a seat. There's a seat right over there in the corner. Hello. Today we're going to talk about Digitalizing Tibet, a critical Buddhist reconditioning of Hjarvard's mediatization theory. My name is Gregory Price-Grieve. I'm head and professor of the Religious Studies Department at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. I'm going to talk today about the Kalachakra ceremony, which I researched with my colleagues Christopher Helland and Rohit Singh. Christopher Helland is a professor at the Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology at Dalhousie University, and Rohit Singh is here with me in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro.
And so with these two verses, if we could think along the meaning of emptiness, it would be really helpful. And so when we come for the...
On July 7, 2014, on day 2 of the primary teachings of the 33rd Kalachakra, Chris Helland, Rohit, and I observed His Holiness the Dalai Lama read from the 2nd century to Indian Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna's Precious Garland and Letter to a Friend. We were participating in the 33rd Kalachakra, which was an esoteric tantric empowerment centered on the Kalachakra Tantra, held in Ladakh, India, between July 3rd to July 14th, and led by the 14th Dalai Lama, Gyaltsen Gyatso. A Tibetan Buddhist ceremony. The word Kalachakra means cycles of time and involves practices of purifications, teachings, and the tantric empowerment. During the 33rd Kalachakra, the Dalai Lama spoke in person to an estimated 150,000 participants, consisting of local Ladakhis, Tibetan refugees, Indian nationals, and other international spectators. Since 1954, either in India or abroad, the Dalai Lama has conducted the Kalachakra teachings, usually every year or every other year, with the 2014 ceremony in Ladakh being his 33rd initiation. The immediacy of the Dalai Lama's charisma was palpable. Ironically, however, what drew us three to this remote Himalayan location was that the ceremony was being digitized. Tweeted, blogged, Facebooked, and video streamed over cyberspace and across the globe. Moreover, we found that the digitalization of the Kalachakra and the Dalai Lama's charisma were not an afterthought, but had been calculated in advance and had been incorporated into the ceremony's discussions, community building, and symbolism. For example, as the teachings began that day, the Dalai Lama thanked those who are here physically and those who are not. In this paper, to analyze the mutual conditioning of the Kalachakra and digital media technologies, we theorize the distinction between digitization and digitalization. What does the small grammatical difference of the AL add to our analysis? As opposed to the analog media, such as film and newspapers, which use a physical or chemical property to communicate, digital media consists of electronic, programmable bits communicable through computer networks. Digitization, a term used mostly by archivists, refers to creating a digital copy of a phenomenon or an analog object. For example, one can click on www.dalailama.com and see a digital image of the Dalai Lama. Digitalization, on the other hand, is not the mere translation of the analog into the digital, but it's furthering the conditioning of the social structures and practices through the processes of being digitized. Usually, digitalization is used to describe the disruption to economies by digital media, for example, Amazon's effect upon retail sales. However, we extend the term to refer to other social fields, particularly religion. As part of a larger project, this paper chronicles our first steps toward creating a theory to describe, analyze, and understand Tibet's digitalization. To begin the process, we undertake a critical reconditioning of work of the Danish scholar Hjavard, who describes mediatization as a long-term process by which media transform society and culture. Hjavard's theory concentrates on how in high modern Nordic countries religion's increasing dependency on the media leads to secularization. While we found the core of Hjavard's theory cogent, there were no evidence for secularization at the Kalachakra, and the ceremony's digitalization actually increased religious content, community, practice, and most of all, traditional authority. Looking through a critical Buddhist lens, we maintain that Hjavard's overemphasis on secularization occurs because of his reliance on a Protestant understanding of religion as a more or less reliable communication with the supernatural. In order to analyze the Kalichakra's digitalization, we aim to recondition Hjavard's theory of mediatization. Our first step is to describe it straightforwardly in this section and critique it in the following section. At its core, mediatization argues that media play a part in the shaping of society and analyze the long-term effects that media have on human life worlds. The driving purpose of Hjarvard's particular theory of mediatization, however, is to describe and analyze the role that religion and media play in what he calls high modern societies, the current globalized, highly mediated, and neoliberal consumeristic world. Hjavard's theory of mediatization of religion can be analyzed through two prepositions and three outcomes. He builds his theories of mediatization of religion upon an analytic and a synthetic proposition. The analytic proposition is the distinction he makes between the merely descriptive term mediation and the transformative mediatization. As a theory, the descriptive term mediatization analyzes how different types of media influence the content of the message. For example, in politics, mediation describes when a tweet's 280 character limit changes the content that a politician can deliver. For Hjarvard, the theoretical concept of mediatization is analytically different because it evaluates the transformative effect that media have on society and culture, and thus how media colonize their institutions. For instance, when a message doesn't just change the content, but the very political structure of democracies. While analytic propositions point to a theory of internal logic, synthetic propositions refer to how the theory interprets the world. Hjarvard's synthetic proposition is that media and religion are similar because they play a part in constructing the reality of lived social worlds. The synthetic framework reflects early theories concerning the social construction of reality of the sociologist of religion Peter Berger. Citing Berger, Hjarvard maintains that, quote, religion has been the historically most widespread and effective instrument of legitimation of socially defined reality, unquote. Relying primarily on European survey data, Hjarvard posits that media like a secular canopy has taken over the role of a modern communal version of the traditional religious world constructing sacred canopy. From his analytic and synthetic proposition, Hjarvard derives three outcomes, the first of which is disciplinary. He maintains that media theory about religion has been dominated by two major paradigms. On one hand are those affect paradigm frameworks concerned with how people are affected by exposure to various media, while on the other is the audience-centered framework, which explores how people make use of media for their own purposes. Skeptical of these approaches, Hjarvard posits mediatization as a third approach, which stresses the interaction and transaction of actors and structures. Hjarvard's second outcome is that the mediatization leads to a secularization by colonizing many of the social functions that organized religions institutions traditionally held. Hjarvard maintains that in high, modern societies, media are an all-embracing force. Yet the problem for Hjarvard is not less religious content in the media. Rather than less content, secularization occurs because, and I quote, a series of structural transformations of religion in the modern world, including a decline in the authority of religious institutions in society, together with the development of more individualized forms of religious beliefs and practices. Hjarvard knowingly sidesteps Berger's later work in which the American sociologist denounces his earlier secularization thesis. Hjarvard supports Berger's original secularization hypothesis by arguing that, quote, increased public visibility is not to be equated with a growing support for religion or an involvement in religion, and that, quote, secularization is still an important component of the modernization process of contemporary societies in Western Europe, the USA, and elsewhere. Hjarvard argues that secularization leads to an increase of what he terms banal religion, the process by which religious practices become loosened from the authority of organized religion, become more and more individualized and subjective because they are guided by the logic of a commercialized media rather than an authentic spirituality. For Hjarvard, banalization occurs in a three-step process. First, he argues that data shows that banal religions serve media logics and not religious logics. Second, Hjarvard maintains because they are not meant to be taken literally, banal religions are inauthentic. Third, because religious practices are anomic, because they, quote, challenge the authority of existing religious institutions by disembedding specific religious meanings from their original context and rearticulating them in new ways, unquote. Hjarvard's theory is limited for understanding Asian religions because it was fabricated in and built to analyze, as Hjarvard himself writes, the, quote, historical developments in northwestern part of Europe. He understands the mediatization of religion both as phenomenon and sociological theory as stemming from and defining of modern Northern European society. As Hjarvard writes, quote, the theoretical framework and analytic outline presented may be more suitable to describe developments in northwestern Europe than elsewhere in the world. Hjarvard is pushing in two directions. Mostly he wants to differentiate the Nordic experience from that which appears in North America. Hjarvard, however, also sees the Western experience as more generally unique and implies that if mediatization appears in the developing world, that it is a product of European culture being exported through globalization. Because of its unabashed Eurocentrism, to be useful for analyzing Tibetan Dharma and Asian religion more generally, Hjarvard's theory requires provincialization. A term recognizes the limitations of using Western social sciences to explain and understand modern Asia. Provincialization, however, does not reject European thought out of hand, but rather reconditions it, as the anthropologist Dipesh Chakrabarti writes, from and for the margins. Hjarvard's theory, even for its stated awareness of its own limited nature, needs provincializing because it naturalizes a Protestant framework which occurs because of the dominance of European survey data, but also because of a crypto-Protestantism that informs and has shaped social thought since the late 19th century. For instance, Hjarvard defines religion as the, quote, human ability to ascribe intentional agency to unexplainable occurrences, to make anthropological projections into a metaphysical world, unquote. His substantive difference implies a transmission theory of communication, that of content being transmitted more or less reliably through different media. The substantive definition forces Hjarvard to make a distinction between banal and institutional religion because the small folk practices of a common religion and the greater institutionalized orders of, quote, official religion, unquote. He defines banal religion as the, quote, beliefs and practices held by ordinary people, and institutionalized religion as that which reflects, quote, official religious texts and practices advanced by the priesthood, unquote. This fits the religious landscape of Nordic countries, but not that of Asia or even North America or other parts of Europe. To recondition Hjarvard's theory of mediatization so that it is usable for understanding the Kalachakra's digitalization, we need to pry apart his core insight from his theory of religious communication. Hjarvard's core insight is that media influence society because of its affordances, quote, make certain actions possible, exclude others, and structure the interactions between actor and object, unquote. In fact, Hjarvard recognizes the media as technologies, each of which has a set of affordances that facilitate, limit, and structure communication and action, unquote. While his overall theory focuses on the functions of religion, his model of religion is a normative one that requires a substantive or transmission theory of religious communication, often assumed by many Protestants. In the post-world period, communication models have been dominated by the transmission or mathematical theory of communication pioneered in the late 1940s by the American Claude Shannon. A transmission theory of communication describes the communication of a message as a unidirectional signal from an informational source through a transmitter and no source picked up by a receiver and finally decoded at its destination. A transmission theory of communication is unidirectional, has one outcome, is causal, has discrete variables, transmits information, is message-centered and has a fixed sequence, and communicates separate events. A transmission theory leads to analysis of communication either as a more or less reliable transmission or as an ideological distortion from the information source. Painting with a broad brush, a Buddhist theory of communication, on the other hand, is bidirectional, processional, reciprocal, continuous, meaning and actor-centered, has flexible sequences, and events are inseparable. Buddhist communication is distinct from a transmission theory because it employs media practices to spread the Dharma through mutual conditioning, rather than being a transmission theory of communication that models communication as the unidirectional transmission of data from source to destination. A Buddhist theory of communication models mediatization as a mutually dependent relationship between two different realities. In a transmission theory of communication, media are neutral conveyors of information whose presence must be figured out as noise. In a Buddhist theory of communication, media must be approached mindfully because they afford different types of interactions which depend on the media, allow for the skillful teaching of different types of dharmic messages. The difficulty with modeling the Kalachakra through a transmission theory is rather than clarifying the ceremony, it further mystifies the highly digitalized mediascape that we encountered. During the Kalachakra, the Dalai Lama often referred to religion as Dharma and described it not as a message but as a shield, and that its effectiveness depended on the context in which it was delivered. In Buddhism, Dharma usually refers to the Buddhist teachings, which indicates not simply the transmitting of information, but also with varying degrees of skill, the creation of effective conditions that lessen suffering. Dharmic messages are not perceived by Buddhists as universal, but are dependent on the skills and means of those who deliver them. A transmission theory of religion leads to an interpretation of the Kalichakra's mediascape as a loss of fidelity to the essential teachings. Yet while there was contention over the digital broadcast of the ceremony, the argument given by the officials assembled were not about the loss of fidelity to the original sources, but about the dangers that the teachings might offer to those unprepared for the initiation. The concern was not about the banalization of the message, but that the message might cause harm to the untrained. While the aim of Protestant communication can be uncritically theorized as a transmission of symbols of belief about the supernatural, the aim of Buddhist communication is not merely to transmit content, but to create conditions which lessen suffering. Because the Kalachakra did not just communicate information, but was aimed at lessening suffering, the suffering of its audiences, what we found was a complex relationship between event and digital communication in which there was not a passive reference that was communicated through the media, but rather mutual conditioning in which the ceremony and its mediascape were mutually dependent on one another. With this in mind, to analyze the Kalachakra, we turn to a Buddhist model of communication that emerged from the ceremony. Following the groundbreaking work of the media scholar Nyingma, we assembled a Buddhist theory of communication by focusing on the work of the 2nd century Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna is the founder of the Middle Way school of Mahayana Buddhism, and we are particularly interested in Chapter 1, Examination of the Conditions, from his magnum opus, The Fundamental Verses of the Middle Way. In this treatise, Nagarjuna makes a distinction between causes and conditions. By cause, he means that something has an essential quality of its nature to bring about an effect on something else. For example, one might argue that in high modern societies, media have caused changes to religion. By condition, on the other hand, he he indicates that phenomena are not essential, but that different phenomena bring about each other's state of existence. In this case, while distinct religion and media would be essential separate phenomena, but would mutually determine each other. Key to understanding the theory of Buddhist communication is the concept of dependent origination. Often argued to be the defining ontological heart of Buddhism, dependent origination states that all phenomena arise only in relationship to other phenomena. Nothing exists on its own. Rather than causing data, information that can be stored and transmitted to be sent from a source to receiver, a Buddhist theory understands communication as mutually conditioning. While distinct poles in a communication act are not different, conditioning indicates how persons, events, or processes play a role in generating and being generated by another person, state, or process.
Thing along the meaning of emptiness, it would be really helpful. And so when we come for the initiation, the preliminary process of initiation and the teachings, of course, the actual transformation should take within yourself, your mind itself, and the preparation for that.
So let me conclude. Our study is not a rejection of Hjavard's theory per se, but rather a Buddhist reconditioning. A critical Buddhist reconditioning of Hjavard's theory of the mediatization of religion is significant for two reasons. First, pragmatically, for our study, it affords the tools to understand the digitalization of the Dalai Lama's charisma, and thereby to understand the Tibetan diaspora's contemporary multimedia, multifaceted, and multi-situation virtual condition. Despite geographical Tibet being subsumed under the Chinese state, these conditions have allowed the Tibetan government in exile, official religious organizations, and politically and religiously motivated individuals to imagine a nation. Second, a Buddhist reconditioning expands Hjavard's theories beyond the Procrustean bed of its Protestant normative framework and affords a theory of mediatization for analyzing Asian religions. Finally, reconditioning Hjavard's theory illustrates how scholars' own religious backgrounds shape research not only by affording particular content in symbolic forms, but also by privileging particular types of theorization. Being aware of the second-order categories through which we interpret religion allows researchers to be conscious not only of how society and culture shape religion, but also of how local theories of religion and media affect the understanding by which we scholars theorize religion itself. Again, thank you all for coming. I look forward to your questions.